Hello and welcome to Michael's Minty Music for today. Today we review Billy Joel's 1989 album Stormfront. It's good, but not incredible in my opinion. This is the track listing, and these are the tracks added to my playlist, 8 out of 10, so most of them actually. This album is definitely good, but it's kind of more a collection of singles with some extra pop tracks than a sort of put together album. The first 4 tracks all feel like standalone singles, and most of the big hits here are still kind of overplayed on the radio, which really harms this album. I Go to Extremes and the Downeaster Alexa are good songs until you hear them way too much, and then they get pretty boring relatively quickly, actually. Same thing with some of the tracks on side 2, such as Leningrad and State of Grace. Even though this is towards the end of his career, most of the tracks haven't aged particularly well. It really sounds stuck in sort of the 1988, 89, 90 sort of music, pop music, and not in a very good way. The flow is alright, but kind of wacky. I don't really think it works well. Side 1 is all pretty upbeat. It kind of gets a little bit slower on the middle track, Downeaster Alexa, but wrapping it up with Shameless, which does make sense as a sort of finale track for side 1. Side 2 can't decide if it wants to be slow or fast. The title track, Stormfront, is pretty upbeat, actually, but then Leningrad and State of Grace really slow it down. When in Rome is mid-speed, which really screws with the flow, and then the final track, And So It Goes, is a slow final track, which would make sense if not for When in Rome, the song that came right before it. Side 1 is definitely the stronger side. I think if those songs weren't big hits and hadn't gotten overplayed, the album would be a bit better, but it still doesn't really flow that well. Overall, this is an album that has a bunch of pretty good songs on it, but it doesn't really come together. Instead, the different singles compete and kind of bring the album down as a whole. There's only one single released before the album itself, and that was We Didn't Start the Fire, which is definitely the biggest hit here. Although the Downeaster Alexa, I Go to Extremes, and Leningrad were also hits off of this one. My favorite track here is also that one, We Didn't Start the Fire. I think it's the only one here that still sounds good despite being overplayed. For a sort of non-hit favorite, I think I would go with weirdly When in Rome. Out of the context of the album, it's a pretty good track. It just doesn't make sense as the second to last track here at all. I rank this album 11th out of Billy Joel's 13 albums, so third from the bottom. Honestly, this album could be ranked higher, but I kind of just personally think that Street Life Serenade and Cold Spring Harbor are just a bit more interesting. Stormfront is probably better quality-wise, but it's not super good as a whole album, and most of the tracks are still somehow overplayed on the radio. Still, I do think that Stormfront is better than The Bridge, his 1986 album, mostly because it has more hits on it. The Bridge and Stormfront are both kind of overplayed late 80s pop ones and not as interesting as really any of his other albums. Stormfront does have the bigger hits though, and it's probably higher quality due to that, although it's pretty hard to tell. They're kind of both in the same sort of style. However, this album does take my top spot from 1989, beating out only Queen's The Miracle, which is decent, but it doesn't have the same number of hits as Stormfront. And there are some tracks on The Miracle which I really don't like. And there isn't really anything on Stormfront which I specifically don't want to hear. Stormfront is definitely the preferred album from the year, although both are a bit disappointing. If I'm being honest, it's not a great year for me, really. Thank you for watching. Next up, I'm starting listening to all of AJR's albums. They won the polls, so I'll be reviewing their debut 2015 album Living Room next up. So stay tuned for that, and as always, stay minty.